During the World War II, millions of men were removed from the familiarity of their everyday lives and placed into environments where certainty no longer existed. For American soldiers sent across the Atlantic, the war was not just a mission or an objective. It was a complete restructuring of reality. Everything they had known about order, safety, and control began to dissolve the moment they stepped onto foreign soil. Before deployment, his life followed a rhythm so consistent that he rarely questioned it. Mornings began the same way, with predictable routines and familiar surroundings. He knew the streets, the people, the pace of life. Even uncertainty felt manageable because it existed within a known framework. There was always a sense that tomorrow would resemble today in some recognizable way. That assumption disappeared gradually, then all at once. Military training was designed to prepare him, but preparation and reality are fundamentally different things. Training created scenarios, controlled, repeatable, explainable. There were instructors, corrections, feedback loops. Mistakes had consequences, but they were measured, contained. War offered none of that structure. When he arrived in Europe, the shift was immediate and undeniable. The environment itself felt altered. The air carried a different weight, not physically, but psychologically. Buildings were no longer just structures. Many were damaged, abandoned, or reduced to fragments. Roads bore the marks of heavy movement, of retreat and advance, of decisions made under pressure. The first time he heard artillery at close range, it disrupted his sense of orientation. It was not simply loud, it was immersive. The ground responded, the air vibrated, and the sound seemed to arrive from everywhere at once. It was no longer something external. It became something that surrounded him completely. His unit moved constantly during those early weeks. There was little time to settle into any location. Movement itself became a form of survival. Staying in one place too long increased risk. Every new position required rapid assessment: terrain, visibility, cover, possible threats. He learned quickly that survival depended on narrowing his focus. Long-term thinking became irrelevant. What mattered was immediate action. Where to step, when to move, how to react. Sleep became irregular, often interrupted. Meals were inconsistent, sometimes rushed, sometimes delayed indefinitely. Conversations shortened. There was less room for reflection. Then came the engagement that would alter everything. The unit had been advancing under the assumption that resistance would be minimal. Intelligence suggested that enemy presence in the area was limited, fragmented, disorganized. The objective was straightforward: move forward, secure the area, continue advancing. But war does not respect expectations. The first gunshots came suddenly, without warning. At first, it seemed like a small engagement, something manageable. But within seconds, it escalated. Fire began coming from multiple directions. The terrain amplified the confusion, echoing sounds and distorting distance. Communication broke down almost immediately. Orders were shouted, but not everyone heard them. Some soldiers moved forward instinctively. Others took cover. A few hesitated, caught between conflicting signals. He dropped behind what remained of a broken structure, trying to reduce exposure. His breathing became shallow, controlled. He focused on what he could see: limited angles, fragmented movement, flashes of activity. He fired, reloaded, repositioned. Time lost structure. Seconds stretched. Actions repeated. He stopped thinking in sequences and began thinking in moments. Fire. Reload. Listen. Move. Around him, the situation deteriorated. Some soldiers were hit. Others called out, though the sound was often drowned by gunfire. The environment felt compressed, as if everything was happening within a confined space despite the open terrain. Gradually, a new realization began to form. Their return fire was decreasing, not because the situation was improving, but because resources were being depleted. Ammunition was running low. Coordination had collapsed. There was no indication that support was coming. He checked what remained of his supplies. It wasn't enough. He looked around and saw the same understanding in others. This position could not be held. The decision that followed was not made collectively, but it happened collectively. Hands began to rise. One by one, soldiers signaled surrender. He hesitated for a brief moment, not out of doubt, but because of what the action represented. Everything he had trained for pointed against it, but continuing would not change the outcome. He raised his hands. The gunfire slowed. German soldiers approached cautiously. Their movements were controlled, deliberate. Weapons remained aimed, but there was no immediate aggression beyond necessary control. Orders were issued in short, precise commands. They were searched systematically, weapons removed, equipment inspected. The process was efficient, almost mechanical. There was no unnecessary interaction, no explanation, only procedure. This moment created a contrast that stayed with him. It was not what he expected, but it was not reassuring either. It was something in between. They were grouped and instructed to move. The march began. At first, he assumed it would be temporary, a short relocation, a transition to something more defined. But as hours turned into days, that assumption faded. They walked for extended periods with little indication of distance or destination. Stops were infrequent and brief. Food was minimal. Water was rationed carefully. The cold intensified everything. It affected movement, perception, endurance. At night, they rested wherever they were permitted to stop. Open ground, exposed areas, uneven terrain. There was no preparation, no shelter beyond what they already carried. Sleep became fragmented, shallow, easily interrupted. During these marches, conversations began to form between prisoners. Quiet, cautious exchanges. Some spoke of camps where structure existed, places governed by rules, where prisoners were held under defined conditions. Others described environments where those rules meant little, where conditions were inconsistent, unpredictable. These conflicting accounts created uncertainty. No one knew what awaited them. Eventually, the march ended. The first visible sign was the fencing. Barbed wire stretched across the perimeter, layered and reinforced. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, each occupied, each positioned to observe movement within the camp. Inside, the layout was deliberate. Barracks aligned in rows, open areas controlled, paths defined. Everything suggested order, but also restriction. They approached the entrance. And there, he heard the name that would define his reality. Stalag Luft III. Crossing through the gate marked a transition that was not immediately visible, but deeply significant. He was no longer part of an advancing force. He was now part of a contained system. The intake process was direct: identification, registration, assignment. Names were recorded, then replaced in practice. Numbers became primary identifiers. He was directed to a barrack. Inside, the environment was functional, not designed for comfort. Wooden bunks stacked vertically, limited space for movement, shared occupancy that eliminated privacy. The air felt different, not just cold, but occupied. The first nights were the most difficult, not because of immediate threat, but because of adjustment. The absence of control created a different kind of tension. There were no decisions to make, no actions to initiate, only waiting. Over the following days, patterns began to emerge. There was structure within the prisoner population, roles developed, responsibilities distributed, schedules created, not imposed externally, but formed internally as a necessity. Food distribution followed routine. Rations were basic. Bread, often hardened. Soup, thin and inconsistent. Occasionally, external packages arrived, introducing variation. Each item carried significant value. Nothing was wasted. He learned to ration carefully. Hunger became a constant presence, but one that could be managed through discipline. Over time, he became aware of the broader framework governing the camp. There were rules that extended beyond immediate control. Standards outlined in agreements, such as the Geneva Convention of 1929. But enforcement varied. Consistency was not guaranteed. Some guards followed procedure strictly. Others operated with variability. Small interactions revealed differences. Tone, timing, reaction. These details shaped daily experience. Time began to lose clarity. Days extended, weeks blurred. To counter this, prisoners created internal structure, activities, conversations, mental exercises, anything to maintain continuity. And beneath everything, a persistent thought remained: escape.